First of all, I think a huge round of applause to Maria and Pavel for putting together an amazing event. It's so Anna and I spend our days sitting behind a laptop, and we sometimes forget that there is a real amazing reality behind Kaggle, and this room kind of reminds. It's incredibly energizing, and I hope, you know, as we do more and more Kaggle Days events, that more of the Kaggle team gets to experience this. It's an incredibly moving and a really powerful thing to experience. So I look forward to spending the next few days with you all. I was thinking a bit about what to talk about today. I was thinking, maybe I'll give a talk on how to win machine learning competitions, but I think there are some better people in the room than me to do that. I was thinking, maybe I'll try and synthesize, some of the things that win competitions. But again, I feel a little bit unqualified. So I was thinking, okay, what do I know that the audience doesn't know? And it was a depressingly short list. But what I thought I might do was give sort of a little bit of a behind the scenes of some of the decisions we've made at Kaggle, some of the product decisions that we've made and why we've made them. You know, things like the birth of Kaggle kernels and so forth. Where these ideas came from, and also give you a little bit of a sense for some of the things that we're thinking about. And actually, it would be very useful. While we're here, Anna and I would love to get feedback on ways that Kaggle can be improved. So, give you a sense for how we've made the decisions we have, some of the things that we're thinking about. But as part of this event, we would also very much like to hear from you. All right. And by the way, Anna and I will do a Q&A. So I'm going to talk for about only 10 or 15 minutes, but leave plenty of time to do a Q&A. And I think we're going to have microphones that will walk up and down the hall with, so that you can ask your questions. All right. So, how many of you know this? Oh, can we switch to the? Yeah. How many of you know this this competition? So we joke that the getting started competitions are like like the Titanic and the digit recognition. They're like the drug that gets you hooked, right? The gateway drug. Actually, I've asked the question before about this data set or this competition for machine learning research, and they say, well, not only do I know this data set, but I can tell you which digits are hard to classify in this data set. For those of you who don't know it, this is a simple getting started competition to take handwritten digits and classify them algorithmically. And one thing, and I'm going to give you a sense for, between 2010 and 2015, Kaggle really exclusively focused on machine learning competitions. We tried a couple of other experiments along the way to grow Kaggle and offer the community more. And one of the reasons that we tried or we experimented with different ideas is we always felt that competitions were a good starting point, but we thought that Kaggle could offer a lot more. One of the analogies I like is in the software engineering community. Stack Overflow was the first community to really get meaningful traction. They do question answering, and they do a very nice job of question answering. But they stayed with question answering and didn't look at expanding beyond. And so there are other communities like GitHub that have ended up being more valuable. And we thought, well, if we can expand the range of Kaggle things that Kaggle does, we can sort of cover more and more and more of what people might want from a machine learning community. So as I said, between 2010 and 2015, we tried a lot of things, and most of the things that we tried and experimented with were not terribly successful. Since 2015, I'm really proud. We have found a formula that allows us to launch things that have turned out to actually get a lot of traction. And I want to give you a sense for kind of some of the things that we have learned about launching new features into Kaggle. So back to the digit recognition competition. With all the competitions, as you all know, we have very active forums, and the forums are incredibly constructive. This is a scientific community, and people share amazingly helpful tips and tricks. As you all know, one of the main reasons people compete on Kaggle is because it's a good learning opportunity, and really the forums are the main way that learning has historically been propagated through Kaggle. And so you see, people are sharing different ideas and different approaches, and all the posts get many comments and so forth, lots of engagement. But if you scroll down, you'll notice there are certain posts that don't get a lot of engagement. And I'm going to click into this one. So in this case, Peng Pei is sharing his neural network code. He could have been sharing a GitHub repo. In this case, he's just uploaded the Python file. Now, in order to get it running, you need the same version of Python. You need the same libraries. So you can see he's got Pandas, Scikit-learn, Matplotlib, NumPy, NoLearn, and Lasagna. Lasagna actually had a breaking API change at some point, so you need to be on the same side of that breaking API change. So it's a huge amount of work to, maybe takes 4 or 5 hours to get his code running, and who knows, you get it running and then you find it's actually a virus. So it was always very sad that people were using the forums in order to learn, but perhaps the most useful thing that could be shared is code, and when code was shared, there was very little engagement. And that was the inspiration behind starting to experiment with Kaggle kernels. And I don't know how many of you remember this, but in 2015, when we first started experimenting with Kaggle kernels, it was literally a text box with a run button. That was it, nothing more. And we got, I think, mixed responses from the community. We got people who found it really turbocharged learning, and people found that it was frustrating that that good algorithms were being shared, particularly, this is still something we rub up against from time to time late in the competition, which could be disruptive. But overall, if you have a look at the impact that Kaggle kernels ended up having, look at the number of upvotes. So if you remember, the number of upvotes on discussion posts were in the range of 50, 60, 70. And the number of comments or responses were in the range of 10, 20, 30. Here you have 400 comments, you have thousands of upvotes. And so Kaggle kernels, we sort of saw in the forums that people were sharing lots of tips and tricks, that code should have been the most useful thing that anyone could share. But code was not getting a lot of engagement, and that was the inspiration to starting to try out Kaggle kernels, and it ended up really, I think, changing the nature of Kaggle. It was interesting. I was in China. I was in Beijing, trying to learn a bit more about the Kaggle community in Beijing earlier this week. And there are, turns out there are 6 or so. Well, I learned about 6 Kaggle clones while I was in China. And I asked, some of the people I met, well, why spend time on Kaggle where you have problems with the firewall, the site is slow in China, the firewall sort of messes with site performance and site reliability, we're not translated. And they said the real reasons are the forums and the kernels, and also the level of competition. So the learning opportunities as a result of the fact that level of competition on Kaggle is very high, plus the forums and kernels mean that for a unit of time spent on Kaggle, they're able to learn a lot more. So it was nice, very nice to hear. Okay, so we started out with machine learning competitions. Many of you will remember that we only initially allowed, had Kaggle kernels attached to machine learning competitions. We started to see something kind of funny happen. I'm actually not going to show you the first competition we saw this was, some of you might remember, at a competition for the city of Chicago to predict outbreaks of the West Nile virus. I have a more modern example of the same thing that I want to show you based on, some of you will remember this challenge, the Quick Draw Doodle Recognition Challenge. So this was a challenge hosted by Google AI. I don't know if for those of you who don't know it, this is based on, you get drawings of, doodles of, a butterfly or a pumpkin or whatever, and you have to classify what the person is trying to draw. Sometimes quite difficult. So you look at the kernels and you see the kinds of things you might expect people to share. Different algorithms, different classifiers, different approaches. We also consistently see kind of interesting, quirky, bizarre bits of analysis. So this one I particularly like. Somebody wrote a kernel exploring whether people tend to draw their circles clockwise or counterclockwise. Actually, I think clockwise or counterclockwise. So it turns out, for those who are wondering, that most people draw their circles, I believe it's clockwise, except for people from Japan and some people from Bulgaria. There you go. Who knew? But it was interesting to start to see people using Kaggle kernels not to compete in the competition, but to do kind of free-form analysis. And as much as we would like to increase the number of competitions, we try and, we have a heavy hand in the competitions that we launch. And so we can't just launch kind of unlimited numbers of competitions. But we also realized that we were holding people back as a result of there was a demand in the community to do more free-form kind of analysis on interesting data sets, and we felt like we were holding the community back. And that's where the idea behind launching data sets comes from. And this is now become a really major part of the site. There's 14,000 data sets on Kaggle. I think it's appropriate. We're in France. There's a wine reviews data set. So this ended up becoming has become a really major part of Kaggle. And what we saw that led to this was people doing free-form analysis on competition data sets. Actually, I think I have a kernel open that I particularly like. I know. Yeah, anyway, one of my favorite kernels on this data set is somebody does an analysis of what he calls the best college wine, which is the most number of points for the least price, which it is in here. I feel like in France, that kind of analysis is probably frowned on. And so then finally, the last thing we launched is Kaggle Learn. And the thing that we saw that made us want to launch Kaggle Learn is, if you look at the most popular kernels, beginner, tutorial, tutorial, tutorial. But one thing, and I know I was chatting to some people last night who are actually relatively new to Kaggle, and one thing that can be intimidating is where do you start? And so there's a lot of appetite for tutorial content, but it was less clear, like how do you get started? Like you're learning data science, where do you go? Today we have 2.5 million users. Let's say we're going to have 10 million users over the next 4 or 5 years. Most of the new members to Kaggle are not currently data scientists, right? They're people. A lot of us have used Kaggle in order to learn and become good at this craft, and that will continue to happen. And so having there was clearly demand in the community for learning content. So having a good structure around that was the motivation behind Kaggle Learn. And so these are, for those of you, probably some of you in this room might have tried some of the Learn tracks, others haven't. But the idea here is these are basically very short form machine learning tutorials or sort of data science related tutorials inside Kaggle kernels. And I think at the top of the page, it's spoken about as the fastest data science education. We sort of think of it as a little bit different to a Udacity or a Coursera, where you'll spend quite many hours going through those courses. In this case, we're not really teaching very much of the theory, but rather we're just trying to get people started. So if I go into the deep learning course, for instance, it's 4 hours. That deep learning course is just, it's 4 hours as opposed to, I think it's 6 months for the main Udacity course. And so basically we're giving people just enough to get started. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of a sense for how, we're very much attuned to usage patterns in the community and to feedback from the community. Some of the areas that we're looking to expand over the next year, and I'll go through the different parts of the site. With competitions, we're interested in running more kernels competitions, and these have a few benefits. One of them is kind of an obvious one, which is we can run constrained compute competitions. So Pavel made the comment that all the competition models, you got to ensemble. Well, maybe we can get away from that if we give you such a small amount of compute that you can't ensemble. But that's an exciting area to start to run more constrained compute competitions. We also would like to push into some of the newer areas of machine learning and AI. So one nice thing about being part of Google is there's lots of teams that we can collaborate with that are working really on some of the cutting edge areas. So we are talking to a team at the moment about different ways we might set up a GANs competition. Some of the challenges there are how do you evaluate, how do you do a nice job of with the evaluation metric for a GANs competition, but we're working through that. We're currently on the lookout for teams, particularly talking to teams at DeepMind about doing reinforcement learning competitions, and these are the kinds of things that become possible as the kernels-only infrastructure gets bigger and more hardened. On the dataset side, I'd love to get to the point where the first place you want to look for a dataset is our dataset platform. It'd be really nice to have the idea of, maybe we have the original Census Bureau data, but you can apply code that creates a new version of the data, and so people coming to Kaggle can either consume the raw data or they can consume the cleaned up data. Some of the other ideas that we're looking at for the datasets platform, we actually have very basic data join recommendations, but that's a really promising area. So if people start to bring their work data onto Kaggle, maybe we can recommend datasets that they can join to. For Kaggle kernels, continuing to build out more robust support, we do eventually want to add things like TPUs. Have them. We're working on a new IDE at the moment, a new user interface for it, and so the idea is we want to make this as strong a hosted environment as one might find anywhere. And the motivation for this is that we think that data science naturally works well in the cloud. The workloads are very bursty. 1 minute you're exploring data, the next minute you're training a deep neural network. And so you want the ability to be able to scale up and down compute is very important. In software engineering, hosted IDEs haven't really worked out. There's things like the IDE that's taken the world by storm at the moment is VS Code, which is even still a desktop IDE. But one difference with data science and machine learning is you don't actually write that many codes. So to the extent there is a little bit more latency with the browser, it seems to be a little less painful. And so products like Kaggle kernels and Colab have been doing very well. And then with Kaggle Learn, again, continuing to expand the coverage of the courses. That being said, as I said, Anna and I are both here for the next 2 days. So to the extent that there are things that you think we should be doing, we'd love to hear from you. Come and find us. And I think we're going to move into Q&A now, and I think Anna is going to join me on stage. Thank you. So what will we do? Will we ask people to put their hands up? And yeah, okay. All right, question.
Hi. First, congratulations for making Kaggle. It's fantastic. Second, I'm more interested in the marketing part, like how Kaggle became so huge as opposed to other competition sites who didn't make it. Any trick that you can share?
Well, I wasn't there at the beginning. I think that one great thing about Kaggle is, so I was Kaggle's first marketing hire, and I joined 4 years ago. And Kaggle had been around and was a huge brand, like even before my time, and was really no marketing investment because of word of mouth. So people like you, it's really been our community that's helped us grow, and people telling their friends and their coworkers and their students the best place to learn is Kaggle. So that's my perspective.
A couple of things I'll add. When Kaggle started, I don't know if many people remember this, there were a couple of other competition platforms. Probably the most prominent was a Polish site called Tuned.it. I think they had run a lot of the KDD Cups. A few things that I think we did a nice job of in the early days. One was I think we were careful in putting together the hosting high quality competitions, and so. It's frustrating. I mean, it happens in our competitions. You all know this, but it's frustrating to put a lot of work into a competition and then find there are issues with it. And so, yes, we definitely have issues. We had issues, and we still have issues with our competitions. But we do work really hard to try and avoid things like leakage. The second is, I think we did. We put probably a bit more emphasis on having a site that's nice to interact with. And so those are the two things that maybe there weren't very many players, but maybe that separated us in the early days. I would say that Kaggle has been extremely lucky in terms of the fact that we've grown to be a 2.5 million person community. I was a statistician by training and just was not that. I did not really like my job and thought this would be a fun. Knew about the KDD Cups and thought this would be a fun thing to bring to business. And I had hoped that I'd be able to support my my goal was to earn the same income I had in my statistics job. I think what's happened since is. I cannot claim foresight here. Machine learning has just blown up as, at this point, I think the hottest trend in technology. And so, had that not happened, we started. Kaggle launched in 2010. 2012 was the quote-unquote annus mirabilis of deep learning. The year the ImageNet results, Hinton won his Kaggle competition, and so forth. And I think the best time to start a community like Kaggle's is just a little bit too early, because once the market hit, once machine learning became a real thing, we were there. We had sort of a bit of a starting point, and so it meant as machine learning became bigger and bigger and bigger, we were well placed to take advantage of that. Looking forwards. We don't want to be complacent, right? And that's why, as well as wanting to make sure we invest in some of the newer areas of AI and machine learning from a competitions perspective, it's also why we think about areas like Kaggle kernels and datasets. My sense in this room is that there's more interest in competitions, but we want to make sure that we build something that is sort of broadly valuable and is useful to as many people as possible. And so, not sort of sitting back and being enjoying the fact that the community is growing, but sort of thinking about where are the new areas we want to invest. I think is going to be a key part of our continued success.
I would also add that a key part of our continued success is just having people like you on the platform. And I'm not just saying that because we're here. We always talk about how the most valuable part of Kaggle are the people like you that are creating content that other people come to Kaggle to look at and learn from. So
absolutely.
Thank you for being here. Apart from, can you tell us some of the benefits of working with Google now? Most of the time we don't see the things that all the other engineers, speaking to Megan, she says that there's an engineer working on ticket for this, a ticket for that. I mean, can you tell us about the whole process and how it's helped you? Because, if anything, it's, superpowered the Kaggle platform.
Yeah, absolutely. So when we were acquired, we were 17 people, and now we're 55. And part of the reason we were 17 people is we had a hard time hiring. We had a certain. We want to hire. Really strong, productive software engineers is really hard. Google has done an amazing job at software engineering hiring, creating a great brand around software engineering hiring. And so once we joined Google, we were able to both tap into the pipeline of candidates that apply to Google, and then the other benefit is people transfer from other Google teams onto our team. It's helpful that Sundar Pichai, the Google CEO, talks about Google as being an AI first company, and people want to join machine learning related teams, and that makes us a relatively attractive team to work for. Hopefully you'll see as we've grown the engineering team, hopefully you'll see things like Kaggle kernels become stronger and more robust, and other parts. Being able to, I mentioned we want to do GANs competitions. We don't have. It's a relatively new area. There's a limited number of world experts. A decent number of them work at Google. Same goes for reinforcement learning and DeepMind. So these are some of the benefits that we have felt. There's also, as part of being a big company, there are also challenges. So we've had to focus a lot more on, Google is target number one for. I think there was a Google was fined recently for GDPR, and so things like that, where as a startup, you have to do some amount of work. The amount of work we do as a Google team is much greater. So there are definitely pros and cons with being part of a large company, but the pros outweigh the cons. Oh, and sorry, one more that comes to mind is Kaggle kernels. There is no way we could afford the free compute.
And just outside of just the kind of technical side, I mean, at Kaggle prior to Google, it felt like we were fighting to survive. I think a lot of people here work at startups, so you know that feeling. And now we have a lot more resources, a lot more room to breathe, and just being able to partner on events like this. Like, we never would have had the resources, both in time or kind of finances, to be able to do that. So as somebody in marketing, it's so nice to be able to have a job now where we can really invest in the community in a way that we weren't able to before.
Okay, so maybe last question. Okay, Konstantin, on the other side. Okay.
A lot of pressure. It's the last question. It has to be a good one.
The person who is asking the question is absolutely great. So
that just
I'm
adds
not
to the pressure.
expecting anything less.
Thank you very much. So my question is, so you have commercial competitions and you have in-class competitions, which were kind of not very active. And are you planning some middle ground where companies can organize their own competition and pay as a self-service and not organized by Kaggle team?
Yes, so that is something we talk about. So I'll give you the history of why we haven't done this. You've noticed with our competitions there's leakage and there are issues, and I would say we're decently good at identifying it up front. It's not so easy to run good high quality competitions. And so that's the reason we have historically been reluctant to offer kind of a self-service option. That being said, I think that the comment that I hear a lot is you have all these tiny little academic conferences that host their own competitions, and they build their own infrastructure and they do it anyway. And so given that they're doing it, why don't we offer them a service? And so it's something that what we will probably do is eventually, and I don't want to commit to a time on this, but it's certainly an idea that gets spoken about a lot, is just like you have featured competitions and you have in-class competitions, having some category of self-service competitions. There are no points attached if we haven't vetted it. But at least it can be a service that we offer. The other source of demand we sometimes get is inside competitions. We have actually run this as I think invisible on the site, but we've run for a few companies competitions internally, and it turns out to be a really great way for people across a very large company, very spread out, to collaborate. Actually, a funny story: when we joined Google, we learned that Google internally had its own competition platform called Kaggle, which was a Kaggle clone, and it was very effective at Google as well. So I think the idea of eventually allowing self-service competitions for both internal competitions, but inside companies and for those who want to host them without our help, is something that is definitely in the water and will very likely come eventually. Yes.
And another thing I wanted to mention, and it's not self-service, but it is much easier way to do a competition. The timeline is much smaller and there's much less constraints are some of the qualitative competitions we've done recently. So the NFL one is the first one that was on the competitions listing, so it might be the first one that any of you saw, but one that isn't supervised machine learning.
Yeah. We had tried qualitative competitions in the past and they hadn't been very successful, but now that we have Kaggle kernels, they seem to be a bit more interesting, and it's a very different audience who are interested in the qualitative competitions from the regular supervised machine learning.